I'm announcing that our proposal for this levy will be a $970 million housing levy.
Well, that's Mayor Bruce Harrell announcing his plan to triple the Seattle housing levy back at the end of March. Well, now it's crunch time on the Seattle City Council as they craft this measure for a public vote. A big public hearing happening this week. Are they still going to hear cheers at the end of this process when the smoke clears? We'll have to see. Also, some big questions about where the newfound revenue of the capital gains tax should be going, and a major hearing this week on the future of the consent decree hanging over the Seattle Police Department. Well, it's Seattle News, Views, and Brews, folks, and we're going to have some answers to these questions this week. Your Coffee Break Political Podcast here with you. I'm Brian Callanan. I'm a host on Seattle Channel. The views expressed here are my own. And I'm here once again with my co-host, David Croman, reporting for the Seattle Times. And David, just when you think the Mariners are on a roll, the Yankees come to town and lay waste to T-Mobile Park. What bothers me the most is just the amount of New York fans who come out of the woodwork and show up at these games. Where are they for the other 150 games of the season in Seattle?
Yeah,
Where are these people?
Yeah, I don't know. I guess a lot of people have moved out here from New York or they travel. I mean, I think Seattle is a nice place to visit in the summer anyway. So I think people, figure, hey, well, let's take a trip and base it around the Yankees or whatever. I don't know.
Yeah.
Something cheap about being a Yankees fan.
I'm right with you, man. That's the exact word. You haven't suffered enough until you've been a Mariners fan. That's for sure. Well, David, thank you as always for joining me here. Thanks also to our patrons. Thanks to our background noise sponsor, City Grind Espresso on the first floor of City Hall. Back to our patrons here. I did want to point out that the Seattle News, Views, and Brews sticker campaign has been activated, folks. We'd love to have you join us as a patron of the show. You get the snazzy decal for just a $5 a month pledge. We feature photos of your sticker on the show too. Patrons, please send in those photos. I need you to email Seattle News, Views, and Brews at gmail.com. Thanks finally to Converge Media. We partner with Converge on the video version of this podcast. Make sure you check it out on Converge's YouTube channel Wednesday nights at 7. Let's get moving with Right Here, Right Now. Well, it is a very busy week ahead. A lot of stuff going on with the Seattle City Council. We've got that possible Amazon walkout this week on May 31st. We touched on that last week. And also on May 31st, I should point out this date, it's a double dip of housing levy committee meetings for the City Council, a presentation in the morning, public hearing in the afternoon. According to city rules, a public hearing is not required for an action like this, but a lot of feedback has been coming in about the need for more housing units that help families, the need for more affordable units spread equitably all over the city. And there's also a lot of talk about the price tag of this measure, near $1 billion, tripling the prior measure from 2016. This would now cost the median homeowner about $380 per year. Now, David, we know Seattleites love to vote yes for levies, but what themes do you think are going to come out of this public hearing this week? What do people want out of this levy? What are they really clamoring for?
Yeah, I mean, there's always sort of tension, I think, with the levies because people want a lot from them. So, I would think people who show up in a public levy, testifying on behalf of a public levy are going to, say we should be doing more, we should build more housing. There's always a tension of, the public feedback tends to be that people want as much as possible. We saw that with the Move Seattle levy. And like with the Move Seattle levy, there's some risk in that because you try and cram as much as you can into it because you keep hearing from people that they want more, but then you actually have to deliver it and execute on it. And the Move Seattle levy has had some issues with that. Not to mention you have to get it past voters. So, early in this stage, I would expect that probably, like I said, it's going to be all more. It's just whether, how much the city council or the city takes that into account.
Yeah, it's this the peanut buttering verb always comes to mind for me. How are you going to spread this in certain ways such that you're handling all these different pieces here, from trying to make sure that there's good transitional housing for people who are homeless, trying to make sure that there are child cares at these different facilities. I mean, there's a lot of amendments rolling around here. And just kind of touching on what you said there, David, what always gets to me about this discussion is how difficult it is to keep up with demand. because we've heard from the Office of Housing. They're saying we need 112,000 units here by 2044, including about 71,000 for people who make less than 80% of our area median income. So the levy, as it turns out, it's not going to build all that. It's going to build 3,000. That's an increase over last levy. And the levy, this last one from 2016 to now, performed very well and exceeded its goals in terms of what the city promised. But this housing levy still provides a fraction of what Seattle needs. Then you throw inflation into the mix, and unfortunately, tripling levy does not mean tripling the amount of housing we're going to see out of this. And I know it's not fair to lay all the woes of housing at the feet of the housing levy here, but I guess what goes through your mind, David, when you consider those numbers? We need 112,000 units, but this is a levy that's going to provide maybe 3,000. Some thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why you hear, even from, the most devout socialists, that there is a market aspect to the housing crisis that I think, except for only, maybe Shama Sawant and some of the most devoted kind of Trotskyite socialists, I think there's an acknowledgement that the government really is not going to produce enough that's necessary to actually solve the housing crisis. And that's why, in the legislature, and we saw those moves towards loosening restrictions on single family zoning, because that does create affordable housing, and it does so, in a slightly more roundabout way sometimes, but and it does so in a way that doesn't require huge amounts of taxpayer money. Tends to be a little faster. So, I think that housing levy is a great example of the benefit, for sure, of public housing or government subsidized housing, and also its limitations, which is that in order to build the amount of housing that would really be necessary for this region, we're looking at billions and billions of dollars, and I'm with space that is probably not there, or at least would be slow to find, and not enough financiers and developers. So it's just shows the limits of tackling the affordable housing crisis from a purely kind of government subsidized angle.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, there are other programs happening too. We've talked about social housing, which is starting to come online this summer. We'll see where that goes. I know there's a group now, that leadership group, that's starting to discuss exactly where these investments need to go with social housing and when that comes online. But I guess what I'm seeing here too, David, is there are a number of different answers that have to happen. It can't be just the housing levy. It can't be just social housing, and it can't be just the market either, because when the market takes over too much, then we don't have these solutions that are in place necessarily for people who are making less income. So it does feel like a balance to me, I guess, between those market forces and the government trying to push back and get these lower income units where they can.
Yeah, I think that's right. Because I think there is actually an argument that had the market or zoning been kind of more permissive for longer, then maybe you wouldn't be in a situation where you need to build this. But the reality is, people are being evicted now. People are being pushed out of the city now, and it takes time for affordable housing to come online. And so, I mean, I think this is a reflection of the fact that, I mean, even people who used to work, who work what used to be seen as sort of middle class, working class jobs, qualify now for this affordable housing, because it's just the median income. The median income has gone up so much, but that leaves a lot of people who are working kind of more middle class jobs behind.
Yeah, and the price of housing has gone right up with it and exceeded it in so many different situations. So thanks for the back and forth on that, David. I wanted to touch on another interesting statewide story when it comes to the capital gains tax revenue that Olympia has been bringing in. So the legislature passed this in 2021, as we know, a 7% tax on the sale or exchange of stocks and bonds. There were some legal challenges, but the state court gave it the thumbs up essentially in March of this year. And the state had originally thought that this would bring in $248 million in this fiscal year, so by July 1st. But the Seattle Times reports that amount is actually $601 million higher, so around $849 million. And where does that money go? Well, the first $500 million goes into public schools, and on top of that, money would go into school construction. And David, I just wanted to thank you first off for making all those multi-million-dollar stock deals. That was very kind of you for doing that.
Yeah.
So we shouldn't have any trouble with our school system at all. But I just did want to ask, did that number surprise you for one? And two, is this sustainable going forward with the capital gains tax?
I don't know. I guess I didn't really have any expectations of what it would bring in. I guess it doesn't surprise me that it turns out we have a lot more rich people in
Yeah.
Seattle or in Washington State than we expected. I suppose it's maybe a Northwest kind of passiveness of people who are probably more rich than they let on. I don't know.
Sure.
Yeah, I guess it's in some ways it's kind of validation, right? I mean, it's not for the people who push for this, because it's not like just a couple people that are then going to move out right away and totally deplete this tax. I mean, it turns out there are a lot more people who are able to be taxed on this. I don't know if it's sustainable. I guess I would think it is. I mean, I thought, of course, Nick Hanauer has always spoken in favor of taxes like this, but I think he made a decent point in a Danny Westneat column, just that for the amount of money that the tax actually costs him compared to his net worth, it's not really worth it to him and the people that he knows to uproot and move to South Dakota or Wyoming. That's a much higher cost than just paying the tax. So, I imagine that the Democrats are feeling really good about that right now.
Yeah. And I guess it does have a connection to the volatility of the stock market for sure. So I think that's kind of built into this whole program, in that, the above that 500 million portion, they're saying that's going to go to capital projects and not necessarily,
Right.
Salaries or something that schools would depend on. But I just wanted to look forward to this, David, with the 2024 session. And I hate to be pessimistic about this, but when do lawmakers start rating this fund for other priorities? Does Olympia take a new approach to this maybe in 2024? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, that's always the risk. I don't know about risk is the right word, but that tends to happen.
Yeah.
Especially with the way the budget is laid out. I think about the transportation budget. Used to always kind of live on its own and not really touch the general fund budget until 2022, when that spilled over. So I think when there is imbalance in funding, it doesn't happen right away, but eventually, if there's something that's seen as a need, as transportation was seen in 2022, there tends to be a little pressure to bleed into other pots of money and siphon those off. So wouldn't surprise me. At the same time, I think it's hard to identify. The schools are in kind of crisis right now, so I think for the next few years, it would be hard to identify, I think, a higher priority for legislators than the schools. So I would think that it will probably be going that direction, at least for a little while.
Yeah. No, good observation there. There's a lot going on with our school budgets, and we've seen that on a statewide level, certainly what's going on here in the city of Seattle. All right, well, thanks for that, David. Up next, we're going to be talking about another major hearing this week for the consent decree process that's been hanging over the Seattle Police Department for more than a decade. What's at stake? What factors will the court be considering here? We're talking about that next on Now Hear This. Well, an important hearing this week as we are releasing this podcast. U.S. District Court Judge James Robart will be holding a hearing on whether the Seattle Police Department has fully complied with the federal consent decree it's been under since 2012. This was a response back in 2012 to evidence of biased policing and that officers regularly used excessive force. Now, as you'll recall, back at the end of March, the U.S. Attorney's Office, the mayor, the chief all stood together and said the SPD is in compliance here with the consent decree. Here's Kristen Clark, Assistant Attorney General from the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division, speaking at that press conference.
Over the last 11 years, policing has changed significantly, and we are confident that the systems the city has built, including robust community oversight, will ensure that policing in Seattle continues to improve in the road ahead.
David, I know trying to predict what Judge Robart is going to say is not a smart idea, but I am trying to figure out what information he's going to be considering, because the city has this federal monitors report showing a 60% decrease in the use of the most serious types of force between 2014 and 2021. Your colleague Sidney Brownstone recently spoke with a local data scientist who's pushing back on those numbers, saying killings by Seattle police have increased over the past decade. The ACLU is in support of these numbers too, saying the SPD needs to do a better job. And that data researcher sent a memo to the court. I know the city's saying her memo is misleading, and we'll see where that ends up. But I'm trying to get this bigger picture, David, of what in your mind is the judge going to be considering? What goes into this decision?
I mean, you're right that it's you can never kind of read his mind in advance. I guess I don't know entirely what is different right now than was the case in a couple years ago, when pretty much the same question came to him. The city has argued now for years, actually, that they should be done with the consent decree. They've tried. This is a kind of different filing with a different city attorney, but still basically the same question. And the judge, Robart, has agreed that the city has met its obligation on most of the basic tenets that were laid out in the original consent decree, but disagreed on just a couple questions around accountability, and it really got derailed by the Seattle Police's response to the 2020 protests. So, I couldn't name what is different now than what was the case then. So from that perspective, I'm not sure that I'm not sure what would have convinced him that this is worth ending. On the other hand, it appears, at least politically, and I would say Robart, he actually does pay attention to. He reads the news all the time. He'll read every article. He's fairly plugged into the politics in a way that I don't know that all federal judges are. But politically, there's basically zero support left for the consent decree. Even the city doesn't want to do it because it's really expensive. Of course, Seattle Police Department doesn't want to do it either. But there's also a sense among kind of reform activists that this is actually starting to get in the way, that the sorts of reforms that the consent decree is demanding don't go far enough. And in fact, sometimes some of the more dramatic changes that people want to see are hindered by the fact that these changes have to then get the approval of this federal judge. So outside of his courtroom, there's almost zero support for a consent decree to continue. But none of that matters if Judge Robart disagrees and thinks it's still doing something irrelevant.
Yeah, it's his call. And I think you bring up an interesting point about that officer accountability piece that he's still concerned about. And I think the city is still concerned about too. At that press conference back in March, they said the SPD still needs some improvement there, and they're going to continue to work with them. And they also mentioned crowd control tactics, which were very much brought into question during the protests of 2020. The big issue there is there's got to be another big crowd and a huge protest to really test out how the tactics have changed and what they're going to be like in the future. So I just worry about, or I guess I'm concerned about the SPD. It's been under a consent decree for so long, it's almost hard to picture it. But what does that post-consent decree department look like, the oversight of it, et cetera? What do you think?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think it was supposed to kind of fall to these three branches of accountability, the Office of Inspector General, the Office of Professional Accountability, and the Community Police Commission.
Right.
Whether they're up to the task at this point, I don't know. I mean, I think in some ways, a lot of what the consent decree right now is doing is writing reports and feeding out data on like how the police department is doing and demanding they do better. And I think there is some sense that could be done by this inspector general that's been set up, and she is doing it now. The thing that's really fascinating to me that I don't see getting sorted out, but the Robart seems to want to sort out in a way that I don't understand entirely, is just around arbitration, which is the kind of big elephant in the room. That if you fire an officer, they can appeal their hearing to an arbitrator, and almost always, at the very least, that the discipline they are given is reduced and sometimes totally reversed. But the problem is none of that is under the purview of the consent decree. That was never part of the original dispute or
Right.
lawsuit. And so it's interesting, and I think confounding to some people in the city that, I mean, I think Robart's heart is in the right place, that he wants to fix this stuff because that is a real problem, but it's unclear what it would take to actually for him to actually be able to do that, short of bringing the union into this lawsuit, in which case you're looking at another 10 years of this thing. So
Right.
yeah, it's confusing. I don't know. I think it's dragged on long enough at this point that it seems to have faded largely into the background.
Mm.
We'll see. It's kind of a question of whether Robart is just tired of this and ready
Yeah.
to call it over.
Yeah, the arbitration piece is so interesting here, Dave, because I think back to 2017, 2018, when the city of Seattle passed a number of officer accountability. The police reform bill, essentially, they passed at that point was lauded as something that was a nationwide success, something along those lines. But lo and behold, after that, there were some negotiations that went on with the Police Officers Guild, again, trying to make sure that they had the rights of their members at first and foremost there. And a lot of those accountability measures were basically bargained away. And so I think that's what the judge is trying to prevent here in the future. Can he do that? That arbitration is happening right now, and it's going to be going on throughout this year because we're just at about the 2.5 year mark with police not having a contract, the Police Officers Guild. So yeah, I'm really interested to see how that plays out too, and if that arbitration piece can be a piece of this, because that's a real challenge, a huge challenge. Let me move on to another interesting benchmark this week. June 1st is the deadline for people to opt out of Washington Cares. This is the payroll tax that goes towards long-term care in our state. There's a lot of pushback on this last year, so the state delayed the implementation of this, changed the program also so that people who work out of state, people on temporary visas could opt out. The Times reports about 10,000 people have done that so far. And that deadline for all the other workers out there to opt out because they already have private long-term insurance, well, that passed at the end of 2022, and about 500,000 people did that. And David, I know this is a little bit of a back page headline, but this went really big that last year, and I'm wondering, are we going to keep seeing this pushback? Will there be some sticker shock when the paychecks come out later this summer? We're talking about maybe $24 a month for someone making $50,000 a year. What do you think comes out of this?
Yeah, there is going to continue to be pushback. I mean, the Republicans in the state hate it. They would love to see it killed completely. I
Or
think there is going to
privatized,
be.
they've said. Keep going. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it is going to be a bit of a sticker shock to some folks. There's also the flip side of we have an aging population and basically no long-term care plans. And so there is a sense that there's a need, but the real tension is this is going to cost a lot of money to do. Some people some people are going to have to pay for it who may never actually take advantage of it. That's always a tough pill to swallow. And this is, I think it's what, 36,000 a year is the number. And when you're talking about long-term care, that's not actually that much. You run through that pretty quickly. And so I guess the real tension here is whether the juice is worth the squeeze.
I think of it in the same way, because when this was brought up a couple of years ago, it's the first state program of its kind to provide long-term care in the U.S. It's important to point that out. And this is a massive cost for families out there. And as you say, a lot more than $36,500, which the state says it's going to provide. And I guess that's kind of where I'm looking going forward here. How and when will we know if this measure is a success? This is going to play out in the years ahead, but I know those costs for care are going to continue to rise. I'm just trying to figure out how the proof of concept even happens with this, David, because I know the supporters of it want to tell people, hey, this is working, but how are we going to even know that?
Yeah, I don't know. Because a lot of this care is, private and out of pocket.
Right.
That people are paying for now. So I would think even tracking, insurance payments would be difficult or impossible. So yeah, I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, I always like to give you some stumpers here, David. So it's, I guess, a rhetorical question as much as anything else. Thank you for engaging on that one. But I did want to talk about something else coming up here. A beautiful new Seattle waterfront with cruise ships and bicycles. A discussion about how different of transportation are getting along or maybe not getting along so well. That's next on Transportation Talk. David, you had a recent piece in the Seattle Times about the new bike path on Seattle's waterfront and how there appears to be a missing link here. It's going to interact with cruise ship traffic, bicyclists are. What did you find out about this, about how bikes are getting through on the waterfront, how that interacts with cruise ships? What do we got?
Yeah, it's interesting, and I think it's relevant because the new waterfront, massively expensive, $750 million, is starting to take shape.
Hmm.
Part of that is this bike lane, this 2-lane bike lane on the west side, so along the water, that connects to basically all the way out to Alki. And it's, as a biker, it seems like it's going to go really well. And then to the north, you've got the Olympic Sculpture Park, and uh, below that, the Elliott Bay Trail, which is, I think, the city's second most popular bike lane behind Burke Gilman. But then in the middle, there's this just like half-mile gap on Alaskan Way, that so bikers or tourists in particular who are maybe going along the waterfront and think, hey, I want to bop up to the sculpture park and check that out on my rented scooter, or commuters who are coming in from Magnolia or Ballard and taking the Elliott Bay Trail, are dumped off into what is basically a 4-lane, almost 5-lane road in some places. So there's broad agreement that there ought to be some kind of connection there. The issue, though, is the city and the Port of Seattle have just not been able to agree on a design, and namely because because of Pier 66, really, where people load onto cruise ships, that is kind of vexing how you get a bike lane through that area on the 100 or so days a year that there are people loading onto those boats. And if you have ever been down there at a time when the cruise ship is in dock,
Yep.
it's mayhem. There's buses and trucks and forklifts and hundreds of people, and so kind of figuring out how you work around that has proven to be difficult. And as a result, there's a pretty good chance that the downtown waterfront is going to open before there's a connection there. And the fear is that then you're going to have this kind of mass of people riding pretty unsafely in an area that has not been developed well for bikers and scooters.
Yeah, and you brought up too just the comparison with the Burke Gilman Trail and the missing link that's existed there for so long. I know that there's a lot of acrimony around that with the industrial neighborhood and cyclists, et cetera. Do you sense that same amount of acrimony or pushback, or, I don't know, fighting between the different forces at work here on the waterfront?
No, no, I don't. And that's not to say it couldn't get there. I think the difference
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
in Ballard, the industry basically doesn't want a bike lane anywhere near them. So they have been fighting its very existence.
Yep.
The port has agreed to, in principle, a bike lane going through there, and they are not fighting the city on it. The problem is just in some ways really an engineering one, which is how do you
Yeah.
make
Yeah.
a bike lane? Because it's really important to bicyclists that for the most part, the bike lane continues on the west side of Alaskan Way along the water, because the argument is
Hmm.
if you try and move it too far, people are just going to ignore it and ride on the west side anyway, and then that creates an unsafe situation. But then it becomes an engineering problem of how do you mostly have a west side bike lane, but when there is a cruise ship in dock, kind of jog people somewhere else. Again, this is in some ways, it's not really a philosophical disagreement at this point. It's just
Yeah.
an engineering one of how do you actually build something like that. And there's not a lot of great parallels of protected bike lanes that are also movable.
Yeah, that's a big one. We'll see what pans out there. Thank you for that, David. We do need to wrap up here. And David, I noticed you had a recent trip to Portland. Your Twitter travels shown there. Do you ever notice things about that city that say to you, "Yeah, they do transportation better than Seattle does"? I know. I always look at these different things too in terms of how different cities do it. What'd you notice on your trip to Portland?
Well, I lived in Portland for a little while, and
Oh, okay.
the thing that stands out to me about Portland is it's much easier to ride a bicycle through Portland. You can be
Mm,
if you're riding your bike in Seattle, you kind of have to be an extreme bicyclist. In Portland, it's much more friendly to. I mean, partially because it's flatter, but it's just much more
yeah.
friendly to casual bike riders.
Mm,
Portland is also just such like a restaurant and bar town.
mhm.
It's kind of its whole it totally revolves around eating and drinking, and So I think that means it's more willing to do things like shut down streets to cars so that people can sit
Yeah.
outside on car streets. And, just walking around Portland, you see that in a way that you don't in Seattle, which is certain streets that have just been in some ways permanently dedicated to people sitting outside and eating and drinking at tables, and no longer dedicated just to cars. And that's something that people have asked for in Seattle, and has largely, there were some temporary versions of that,
Yeah.
but the ones in Portland at this point are looking fairly permanent. So that has not happened in Seattle.
Interesting. Well, you really do need to look to our neighbor in the South. So thank you for that, David. Interesting stuff going on for sure. Thank you to you, and thanks to everybody listening to Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's going on in local politics. The podcast here is on Apple, Spotify, wherever you like to listen. And please find Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon. Show your support. Thanks also for watching on Converge Media 2. We'll see you next time. Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2023.